Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. We are glad that you are with us. Some are out visiting because it's Mother's Day. I hadn't forgot. It's Mother's Day. We're very thankful for our mothers, and we do honor our mothers. So happy Mother's Day to you. They and Tim had a good life. They were established in their community. They both had good jobs. They both loved what they were doing. Their kids were pretty much grown, out on their own, many of them, and they were doing well. Tim decided that he wanted to take on a new job. And his wife was somewhat reluctant because it was different than what he was doing. And not only was it different than what he was doing, but it was a job that would require them to move several hundred miles away from where they were established. And moving away meant also moving away from the kids and the potential grandchildren. And so the wife was reluctant, and so yet Tim was very insistent, and so he bought gifts, and he sweet-talked his wife, and he promised things, and he did a lot of things in order to go and take on this new venture. Today, I want us to talk about a woman that took on a new venture in life and left. We do honor our mothers on Mother's Day. In 1906, a lady by the name of Anna Jarvis started Mother's Day. But you've got to understand a little bit about Mother's Day to appreciate Mother's Day, I think. Anna Jarvis actually started Mother's Day for the reason of celebrating mothers who had lost children in battles and wars. Anna Jarvis actually was a caretaker for a lot of the soldiers during the Civil War. She didn't care which side they fought for. If they were injured, she thought they needed someone to care for them, and she would take care of them. And she was always moved by the plights of mothers that had lost children in war. And so she did not like, towards the end of her life, interestingly enough, she did not like that Hallmark had taken all this over and that we ought now have all the greeting cards. And Ethan and I had to run out to Walmart last night about 9:30. I still saw people buying Mother's Day cards at 9:30, 10 o'clock on Saturday night. But, planning's everything. But she didn't like that part of it. She thought that it should be to honor mothers, especially that had lost. But she began it in 1906 and 1907. Then it began to take off in other states. And then by 1911, Woodrow Wilson signed it as a declaration that this would be something that the United States would do to honor their mothers on the second Sunday of the month of May. And so we honor our mothers today. We're thankful for our mothers, those of us that mothers have already passed on. We remember them and honor them and appreciate what they did for us. Those that are still alive, we're thankful for them. Sometimes we're a little mixed up. Our sweet granddaughter walked in this morning where Suzanne and I was and said, "Happy birthday." So it's all right. It's all relative. But as we honor mothers, I want us to think about a particular woman. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to the book of Ruth. I want us to honor a lady, and I think that Mother's Day, at least for me, at least in this day and age now, at the point where I am in my life, is not only remembering mother, but also to be thankful for my wife, for my daughter-in-law, and for women in general. And so today, our effort is really to tip hats to just a good woman. We find in the book of Ruth, we find a great story. It's 4 chapters long. It's a short book. It's in between. If you look, you remember Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel. So you have right after the king, or right after the time of the Judges. Matter of fact, it says in chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, in the time of the Judges. Because remember, Judges technically do not end at the end of the book of Judges. Now remember, the Bible itself is not in chronological order anyway, but it was in the time of the Judges that a man by the name of Abimelech, his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, went to what would be considered Moab. Now they lived in Bethlehem, but they decided to go to Moab, and Moab would be east of the Dead Sea. Matter of fact, more southeast of the Dead Sea. Adjoined part of their, if you will, their line territory would have been southeast part of the Dead Sea over then, or in southwest area there. They went there because there was a famine in the land, and they'd heard that there was food there. While living in the land, their 2 sons found daughters, or daughter-in-laws, found wives, one by the name of Orpah and one by the name of Ruth. The sons and their father, Abimelech, had all died. As we know and note, there were no social programs. There was no government taking care of you, no social programs, no welfare, nothing of that nature to help for widows. They were strictly then, if you will, at the mercy of their family and what little handouts they could be given. And so, as Naomi faced this issue, she begins and decides that she's going home. Now, you got to remember, she has been in Moab for a long period of time, because we don't know from what point they got to Moab to the point when Chilion and Mahlon married, but evidently from the time they married till the time that they passed away, and thus Ruth and Naomi began to leave, is 10 years, the text tells us. And so, married 10 years, these 2 young men die, and Naomi decides, we're going back home. We're going back to Bethlehem. We're going back to where people know us. We're going back to where it's familiar. We're going back to family. We've been in this country long enough. And so she turns to her 2 daughter-in-laws, and she turns to them and she says, go ahead, you can leave. It's all right. And they're reluctant at first. Both of them, no, we're gonna stay. And finally, Naomi decides to push them a little bit further. How is it? You can't stay. I'm old, I can't bear children. And if I bear children, are you going to, if you will, discipline yourself enough so as to not have another husband until these boys grow up and are old enough? And first of all, that's just not going to happen. It can't happen. I'm old, but you can't do that either. And so Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and goes her way. But Ruth, in that famous passage in Ruth 1, says, entreat me not to leave thee nor forsake thee. Don't ask me to leave you. Don't ask me to forsake you. Where you go, I go. Your land will be my land. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Now, I want you to just think right there for just a second. I want you to think about what this lady is giving up. She's going to give up homeland. She's going to give up her people. She's going to give up where she's been familiar with and is familiar with, and she's going to go to a strange land. Not to her mother-in-law, but to her. She's basically saying, I am committed to you, and I'm going to live with you all the rest of these days. And so she even goes a little further, and she makes a statement. Your God will be my God. She's going to change from the Moabite gods, plural. The Moabites had a system of gods, and one of their main things was sacrifice and human sacrifice. So you might say she was going to go from a heathen religion to a monotheistic religion, one God, our God. She was willing to do that, and willing to serve God and worship God as her mother-in-law did. And she says, this is what I'm choosing. This is what I want to do. And so they began to make the journey, and they return to Bethlehem. When they get there, oh, the people are excited. So excited, if you will, that there's seemingly, if you kind of read the text, there's almost a party going on. But she no longer wants to be called Naomi. She wants the Hebrew term, Mara. Why? Why call Mara? Because it means bitter. Bitter. I've lived a life and it's tough. And I want you to know I've had it rough. And so it's interesting because somewhere seemingly in between chapter 1 and chapter 2, she goes back to being called Naomi. But nevertheless, they're at home now. They're in that home country. And Ruth says to her mother-in-law, hey, let me go out. Because there were no social programs, one of the things that young ladies could do is to go out in the fields. The fields, the corners of the fields would not be harvested. They were left for the poor and for the widows to come in and to glean from. And that also, once a field was finished, a field was completed by those that were harvesting it, they could, the widows and those that didn't have, they could go out into those fields and glean or clean the fields of those things that the harvesters had left. And so she simply asked Naomi, can I go to the fields and can I gather the crop or gather what I can for us? Why, sure. Go ahead. And so she goes. And she goes out in the field. And she's out in the field, and there's this man that walks up. And he calls over, if you will, the servant that is the head of the harvest group. And he calls him over and he says, hey, who's that? Well, that's Ruth. That's the one, she and her mother-in-law came, they've been in Moab. They came back and not only did they come back, but she wanted some stuff. And so we're letting her glean the fields and okay. And so Boaz pulls Ruth over. He tells her, stay with the women of the field. He says, whatever the men have pulled to drink, you can drink. And so he's giving her water to drink. He also allows them to share, if you will, their food with her. And she's cared for. She's thought highly of. Boaz is taking care of her. She comes home, Ruth comes home that evening, and she tells her mother-in-law, as her mother-in-law, Naomi, says, where have you been? What have you been doing? What field did you go to? And she tells Naomi, oh, well, guess what? What? We're kin to him. Wonderful. Stay in his field. Do not be seen in another field. Stay in his fields. Do whatever he's told you to do. Glean from his fields. Wonderful. And so she does that. She stays in fields. She gleans from the fields of her kin. She gleans from Boaz's fields. We get then, if you will, to the 3rd chapter. And Naomi says, we need to make security for you. Now, understand and remember, I know you do, but remember that under the old law, part of the things that you did for a family is that if a husband died, and especially if the woman did not have children, then the next kin, usually the brother, took that young lady for a wife and had children with her so that the name of the family could be kept going. But now remember, There's no other brother for Ruth to marry. And so Ruth is left without child, which was considered a blessing from God, number one, to have children. But she's not only without child, but she's also in a strange land. She doesn't know these people, and seemingly, maybe, she's not that interested. But Naomi says, no, we got to fix all this. And so Naomi says, get yourself ready. The idea there is sort of clean yourself up, fix yourself up, pretty yourself up. But the idea also, if you really read the text, the Hebrew text, is to get your outer garment and go out into the field. Boaz is at the threshing floor. And at night to go and lay at his feet. And she does that. Boaz has been working most of the day, or if not all of the day. He has eaten, he has drank, it says. He is happy, he lays down. Now, I want you to remember, they're out in the fields. And depending on how dark the night was, would depend on how dark it was. If the moon was gone, if it was, say, cloudy, and thus there was no light there, it was dark. It was dark because they didn't have street lights. Ben Franklin hadn't come around with the idea of street lights yet. And so it's dark. And he wakes up in the middle of the night. He wakes up about midnight. And who is this? And she identifies herself as Ruth. Well, to make this story a little bit more interesting, he says, okay. He says, you sleep there the night. He says, and the next day we're gonna take care of all this, but you need to know something. You need to know that you have the next of kin, a kinsman. I'm kin to you, yes. You see, that's why she had wondered why in the world Boaz had been so kind to her. And it was because he knew her. He knew what kind of lady she was. We'll get to that as we make application. But he says, I'm kin to you. Okay. She already knew that because her mother-in-law had already told her, but now she knows. And he says, the next day, he says, now there's one that's even, if you will, more kin to you. We don't know his name. The Bible never calls his name. It just says the next of kin. Don't know why. But nevertheless, while not identified, all of a sudden she has hope. Ah, yes, we're going to have a husband. We'll have a child. And the line will go forward. And everything will be exactly as it should be and the way it should be. And so we get then to the 4th chapter. In the 4th chapter, this next of kin is called in. He comes, and evidently at the gate there, and remember at the gate of the city, that's where they did everything. That's where they did the legal aspects. That was the courtroom, if you will, of the day. That's where all legal proceedings carried on. And so they were there at the gate, and evidently they see this next of kin fellow come up, and old Boaz says, hey, come here. And he carries some witnesses with him. Hey, come over here. I want to talk to you. And he carries him over there. And he says, do you remember Naomi? Yeah, I know Naomi. Yeah, she's, I'm kin to her. Yeah, we're all kin. Yeah. You need to take her on. But I want you to feed her. Yeah, I can do that. I can feed her. Yeah, I know, she doesn't have a husband. I'll take care of her. And you need to buy her land. Well, yeah, I can do that. Oh, yeah, by the way. Ruth? Yeah, I've heard about her. You need to marry her as well. Wait a minute. This would have ruined my inheritance. I can't do that. I can't take this on. Now remember, and let me just throw in a little history here, just for your enlightenment, if you will. Probably you already knew this, but just to remind you. In the Old Testament, there was what was called a kinsman redeemer. And we often think of the kinsman redeemer, that his sole purpose was that if somebody in the family was killed, it was his responsibility to go out and seek justice for the family and kill that individual. But a kinsman redeemer had a lot of other, if you will, purposes. And one of them was to marry, to keep in line. And so if this next of kin had married Ruth, he would have been considered her kinsman redeemer. So there's a lot of other facets to that. But this guy says can't do it. Now notice he was willing to take on Naomi. He was willing to buy the land, but he was not willing, for whatever reason, and we don't know, he was not willing to marry Ruth. And so Boaz, who had claimed to Ruth that he would take her on if this near kinsman wouldn't. And when he wouldn't, and there's an interesting facet there, because when he wouldn't, you know what he did? You remember what he did at the gate? He handed Ruth his sandal. Why? Because if you couldn't keep a covenant like that, you handed the individual your sandal, and we don't have in the text, but it's interesting because you go back and look at the old law. By the old law, she's supposed to spit in his face because he wouldn't uphold what he was supposed to uphold. Well, why in the world give a sandal? Well, that's just what the law required, but probably it was because shoes were considered what was worn by free men, and you were slaves if you didn't have shoes, and so there was maybe a sign there for the people. We don't know, and biblical text doesn't tell us, history doesn't tell us. We don't know. It's just part of the agreement that they had. Well, so he goes his way, and Boaz fulfills family responsibilities. He takes Ruth on as his wife. They have a child. They have a child. They name that child Obed. Go back and look in Matthew chapter 1 and see if you don't find within the lineage of Jesus a man by the name of Obed. God providentially cared for this family. And through that line, Jesus came. And so, when Ruth had this child, she came and brought her to Naomi. And Naomi became this child's caretaker. But in being the caretaker of Obed, when Ruth laid Obed upon Naomi, these wonderful words, I believe God, that he's a nourisher and a restorer of life. A nourisher in old age and a restorer of life. Now, you got to remember those words. They're important. I'll remind you of them later. And so, if you will, the story, as the book of Ruth, comes to a close. It's a great story of a lovely life. But we ask ourselves, what made Ruth's life so lovely? If Ruth's life was lovely, if everything seemingly flowed really as it should have, what were some things that really made Ruth's life so lovely? Well, there are several, but let's talk about a few of them. First of all, Ruth was a committed lady. She made a commitment to her mother-in-law, a commitment that she really didn't have to keep. A commitment from a standpoint of she didn't have to go with her mother-in-law. Remember, Orpah had gone off. She had kissed her mother-in-law and she went away. Ruth could have stayed in Moab. Ruth could have stayed with her people. She could have religiously practiced the things of her people. But she did not. She felt a commitment to her mother-in-law, a commitment that carried over by Ruth chapter 2 when she was willing to go out in the fields and gather for her mother-in-law. In other words, you stay here, I'll go out and do the backbreaking work that needs to be done to take care of us. There was a commitment there, a commitment to family, and evidently a commitment also to God. It reminds us of a lovely life. A lovely life needs commitment. A lovely life needs to be committed, first of all, by all means to God. When we make our commitment to God, we're willing to give up, as she gave up of the old Moabite practices, of the heathen practices of sacrifice and worshiping many gods. We need that commitment. I said, I'm willing to give up my life and I'm willing to serve the Lord. That I realize that I love the Lord more than I love anything. And thus, according to 1 John chapter 5, if we really love the Lord, we're willing then to commit, yea, even our very selves. And as Paul said in that wonderful passage that we're so familiar with of Romans 12, verse 1, to give ourselves as living sacrifices to God. We're willing to be individuals that are willing to say, Lord, I want to give myself, and I want to give all of myself to you. I'm committed to you and to your way. I want to do your will, and I want to do it the way you have said to do it. Ruth's life was lovely because it was committed. It was committed to her family. It was committed to God Almighty. It was committed to God's ways. But Ruth's life also was lovely because she was virtuous. Matter of fact, in chapter 3 and verse 20, or chapter 3 rather, we find there remember when Boaz, when Naomi had told Ruth to go fix up, and she laid at his feet in the middle of the night, and there was this promise then made by Boaz that he would take care of her, but they were going to find someone else that was more kin, if you will. One of the first things he said is, we all know you are a virtuous woman. You look up the word virtuous and you find out that the word virtuous means is that she was a woman of good character, high moral standards, willing to do what was right and practice what was right, willing to see through what was right, but an individual that we might say is an individual that would really be worth emulating. Why? Because she is a wonderful woman. She is a woman that has, as the old saying goes, all of her ducks in a row, but not only all of her ducks in a row, but she is a woman that is of high character. Not a character, but high character. Ruth is lovely because of who she is and what she practices. Paul would talk about in Colossians chapter 3 to put to death the old man. We've talked about that before. Put to death the old man, put him off, have nothing to do with him, put on the new man. Remember? That's what Ruth did. Ruth was virtuous in her commitment to the Lord, but Ruth was virtuous in what she was willing to do to help her mother-in-law. She did not, by law, she did not have to help her mother-in-law. She did not have to do the backbreaking work. She could have even said, hey, you come out here, you're no better than I am. And by the way of life of our day, you're supposed to work out in these fields like I am. You get out here. She didn't. She understood the idea of being virtuous. She understood the idea of doing what God says, living the life that God has said. For us to be virtuous, we must be, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17, we must come out from among them, talking about the world, and be separate, and touch not that which is unclean. You see, we need to be individuals that are willing to give up self, to crucify self, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, and say, it's no longer I, Lord, but it's you that lives in me. I become, as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the fragrance of Christ. What are people smelling? Are they smelling Jesus when they see us? Were they smelling God when they saw Ruth? The answer was yes. Ruth was virtuous because she was an individual that was committed. And so, as Paul would remind us that we're to walk worthy of the Lord in all things pleasing, being fruitful in every good work. Colossians chapter 1, verse 10, that was Paul's prayer, or part of Paul's prayer for the church in Colossae. It needs to be the prayer of our life as well. That we're people that see or are seen in us as being virtuous, being high character, high quality individuals that are not in the world from the standpoint of being participants, but we stand above the world, not as arrogant, haughty individuals, but as individuals that are letting the light of Christ shine in our life and through our life so that they see our character. They see who we are and what we are, that we're living the life that God would have us to live. And so Ruth was virtuous, but her life is beautiful because she was courageous. I want you to think about the fact of what she gave up. We've talked about it a couple of times, so we'll not go over it again. But I also want you to think about the fact that she was willing to take on a husband. You might say, well, why is that so courageous? Well, it's courageous from this standpoint. She doesn't know what's going to happen, how it's going to be. And she, according to the first chapter, had been married for 10 years without a child. That was just uncommon in that day and age. That didn't happen. Matter of fact, to have a child was to be blessed by God. And so she was seen as somebody from a Jewish standpoint that wasn't blessed by God. And yet she's willing to go into these people and talk to these people and be amongst these people, to live among them. She's courageous. She's courageous in what she does. She's willing to go, as her mother-in-law tells her, to go in the middle of the darkness and to lay at the feet of Boaz. What is she risking? She was courageous. We need to be people of courage. Talked a little bit about this in Bible class this morning, in a time and an age in which religious tolerance is really religious intolerance, and people, simply put, are not willing to listen to the truth, but not only just not willing to listen to the truth and thus say, you have what you want to believe, and I'm going to have what I want to believe. You go your way, and I'll go my way. There is this idea of I have what I believe, and I don't want to hear what you have to say. And you shut up, and you be quiet, and you have nothing to say, and you have nothing to do, and you do not teach about this Jesus. But as Christians, we need to be as bold as lions. God has not given us a spirit of fear, really, has he? That's what Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1. Power and love and sound mind. God's given us boldness. It was the boldness of Peter and John that they noticed in Acts chapter 4 when they gave a defense of the gospel. They noticed the boldness of Peter and John. We're fixing to study on Sunday morning next week, Lord willing, Acts chapter 7, and we'll see the boldness of Stephen. These folks stood up for the truth. And in a day and age that calls us to cower down, we need to be more like Ruth and courageous in our beliefs and courageous in our life and willing to move forward. To be bold in what we believe and bold in what we stand, that this is true, this is the Word of God. I'm going to practice it. And in a day and age in which we simply find it a whole lot easier, more to cower than to be courageous. Do you remember the old movie? It's not that old, really. We bought a zoo, or I bought a zoo, in which the young boy is afraid to tell, and it's a little boy, but he's afraid to tell the girl that he really likes how beautiful she is to him, and how wonderful she is. And one of the old patrons there looks at the little boy and says, 20 seconds of courage may change your life. In other words, all you got to do is talk to her for 20 seconds. And it may break the ice, it may change everything, and it may change your life. 20 seconds of courage in this day and age is all we need. And it can change things. But then Ruth was also, she was kind. She was kind to Boaz. She was kind to Naomi. There's a kindness that God gave to Ruth. Matter of fact, when Ruth, in chapter 2, when Ruth brought grain back to Naomi for them to enjoy, Naomi made the profession that, blessed be the Lord, for he has not forgotten his kindness towards the living and those that have died. They counted God to be a God of kindness, but she was a lady of kindness. We need that kindness. As we have opportunity, we're to do good, Paul said in Galatians chapter 6. We're to be individuals that truly practice what this Bible says with regards to being kind to others. Oh, people may not be kind to us. We realize that. But yet at the same point in time, too, we're to have the same mind. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. What's that same mind? Well, he's talking about the church, and he says the church needs to have that same mind, to be kind. not just within the church, but to be kind outside the church, to be individuals that are really kind to others, no matter who they are, no matter what they are, that we need to be supportive, that we need to be individuals that are sensitive to the needs of others, and we need to help them. Let nothing be done through vainglory, deceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than themselves. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. That's what God calls upon us to be. Jamie was in a spelling bee. This was many years ago. The prize for the spelling bee was a Bible, so you know it was many years ago. Spelling bee was public. Parents, grandparents had all come, and everybody had come into the little room to watch the spelling bee. And Jamie missed her word, and Sally won the Bible. When they got ready to leave, Jamie was riding with her mother, and her mother said, "Jamie, you knew how to spell that word." "Yes, ma'am, I did." "Well, why didn't you spell it correctly?" "Oh, Sally. You know, Sally's parents don't have much, and she doesn't get very many gifts very often. And she had seen the Bible, and she wanted it. And I've got a Bible. I thought she could have it. And so she spelled the word correctly, and I didn't." Kindness. May that kindness be in our life, just as it was in Ruth's. You look at this book, and you see that it is in between the book of Judges and 1 Samuel. And you ask yourself, why in the world was this book here? Why is this story told? Well, think about what went on during the period of the Judges. The children of Israel, to make oversimplified, the children of Israel kept leaving God. And God, when they would leave God, they'd have problems, and God would raise up a judge or a champion, and then lo and behold, they'd turn back to God and they'd serve him for a long period of time. I believe the purpose of Ruth is to teach us, as it taught the children of Israel in that day, that you can leave God and you can walk away from God, and you might not even want to have a part of God. But God is constant, and God is there, and God has not forsaken his kindness towards you, and God's willing to take you in and take you home and let you be his. And thus he, according to the 4th chapter, is a refresher of life, an encourager for those of age. That's the purpose of Ruth. And that story is a lovely life because it reminds us we may leave God. We may not even come to God, but God is home calling us to come with open arms. And so this morning, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, won't you come? All together we sing.